During the early decades of the 17th century, Siberia was not merely a frozen wilderness, but a vast prison under the dominion of the Russian Tsars. It stretched endlessly, covered in white silence, and ruled by frost. To the court of Moscow, it represented both punishment and expansion, a land to which men could be sent to vanish. The rulers who commanded such exile believed in cold as a tool of control. Among them stood Tsar Mikhail Romanov, the first of a dynasty that would turn suffering into a form of order. Mikail Romanov rose to power after the time of troubles, a chaotic period following the fall of the Rurik dynasty. Russia had been torn by civil wars, foreign invasions, and famine. When Mikail was chosen as Tsar in 1613, the nation was desperate for unity. He was only 16 years old, guided by his father, Patriarch Filaret, who shaped his policies and faith. The Romanovs sought to rebuild authority through faith, fear, and the rule of law. And in Siberia, they found the perfect stage to enforce both loyalty and silence. The early years of Mikhail's reign focused on consolidating internal power. He restored Moscow's influence over distant provinces, re-established relations with Sweden and Poland, and revived trade through the Arctic routes. But with expansion came rebellion. Cossacks, peasants, and old nobles often resisted taxation and military recruitment. The empire was young, and punishment was the language of control. Siberia, newly explored by merchants and soldiers, became the ultimate site of exile. By the mid-17th century, the Tsar's administration began to formalize Siberian exile as a state instrument. Those accused of treason, heresy, or rebellion were banished across the Ural Mountains. Many never returned. The harshness of the land became part of the sentence itself. What the courts could not accomplish through execution, the cold achieved without fail. The state needed no gallows where nature could punish. Tsar Mikhail's governance was shaped by religion as much as by fear. He viewed punishment not only as retribution, but as purification. To him, suffering could cleanse the soul of sin. Churches throughout Moscow taught obedience through the fear of divine judgment. When the empire's laws expanded eastward, these same doctrines followed. Priests and soldiers traveled together, bringing icons, crosses, and iron chains. The line between salvation and torture blurred beneath the frozen sky. The Romanov dynasty's growing bureaucracy required strict control of labor and loyalty. As the Siberian fur trade expanded, maintaining order among settlers and prisoners became vital. Any act of rebellion was treated as an affront to both God and Tsar. Reports from governors in Tobolsk and Irkutsk described the first experiments in public punishments. Exiles were exposed to the cold as demonstration. It was not yet formalized as a punishment method, but hinted at what would later become known as the ice block executions. Quick reminder, if you are enjoying, do like the video and subscribe the channel for upcoming historical torture content. Mikhail's government emphasized obedience through visible suffering. Public displays of punishment were considered lessons in morality. Streets of Moscow often saw floggings, branding, and mutilations. The message was clear: disobedience led to pain, and loyalty ensured protection. Yet in the vastness of Siberia, such spectacles found a new expression. Instead of crowds, there was only the wind, and instead of fire, there was ice. The foundations of the Siberian penal system were laid through decrees that classified crimes by their moral weight. Religious dissent, defiance against authority, and treason were considered sins against the divine order. These offenses often carried the sentence of exile. The condemned were forced to walk hundreds of miles in chains through forests and snow until they reached remote settlements. Death during the journey was not counted as tragedy, but as natural consequence. Under Mikhail's successors, these systems hardened into formal policy, but their roots began with his rule. His efforts to centralize authority demanded mechanisms of deterrence. The cold itself became a silent enforcer. The administration viewed Siberia as both a frontier and a punishment ground, a landscape that required no scaffold or executioner. It was said that a man sent there was already half dead. As the empire expanded, Mikail maintained a careful balance between mercy and discipline. Official records from his reign show numerous pardons but also numerous exiles. Entire families were uprooted from their homes, stripped of possessions, and sent to live among the frozen rivers. The empire's message was not cruelty for its own sake, but survival through obedience. The fear of Siberia maintained order within Moscow's walls. Mikhail's rule marked a turning point in Russian governance. It transformed punishment from immediate execution to prolonged suffering. The ideology behind exile shaped the empire for centuries. The state saw value in control through endurance. The cold became both a weapon and a warning. Punishment was no longer confined to the act, but extended through time and distance. In administrative documents, Siberian exile was described as correctional, not terminal. Yet few who were sent there survived more than a few years. The state recognized this but did not intervene. Death by cold was not execution by the hand of man, therefore it did not contradict religious law. It was the will of nature and, in their belief, the will of God. Tsar Mikhail's leadership brought Russia out of chaos and gave it stability, but it also established the foundation for a culture of sanctioned suffering. His reign emphasized discipline over compassion and obedience over justice. The empire grew stronger, but its moral landscape froze alongside its physical one. Siberia became both a geographic expansion and a spiritual symbol of punishment. By the time Mikhail's son Tsar Alexei took the throne, the philosophy of control through cold had already become embedded in Russian law. Mikhail's reforms ensured that the empire's reach extended to the ends of its icy frontiers. The exiles who walked into the snow carried not only chains, but the embodiment of the state's authority. They were reminders of what disobedience meant in a land governed by frost. Under Mikhail's reign, the seeds of the ice block punishment were sown. It began not as deliberate torture, but as exposure, as punishment through the environment itself. The empire learned that nature could serve as its executioner. The frozen lands required no gallows, no pyres, and no swords. The silence of Siberia became the perfect expression of power, cold, endless, and absolute. The Romanov dynasty's first Tsar left behind a legacy of endurance and obedience. His governance taught his successors the value of fear wrapped in piety. Through faith and frost, Mikhail Romanov transformed the Siberian frontier into a tool of governance. What began as exile would, in later generations, evolve into one of the most chilling punishments in imperial history: the ice block executions that turned men into frozen monuments beneath the snow. The reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich began in 1645, inheriting both the stability and the severity built by his father. He was known as the most gentle Tsar, yet his rule expanded the reach of state punishment further than any before him. His laws, rooted in the Sobornoye Ulozhenie of 1649, codified exile, labor camps, and corporal punishments into a unified system. Under this legal order, Siberia evolved from a place of banishment into an organized machinery of control. The empire's need for discipline, labor, and fear converged in the icy expanse of the north. The Russian Empire was still young but already vast. Its rulers faced rebellion, religious schisms, and the challenge of governing distant lands. The Old Believers, a sect that resisted church reforms, became one of the earliest large groups to face exile under Alexei's decrees. Their refusal to conform was seen as both heresy and treason. The empire responded with spiritual and physical punishment. For many, exile to Siberia meant slow death in the cold. Over time, those deaths became lessons for others. The early records of forced exposure to the cold appear during Alexei's reign. These were not yet formalized as a distinct punishment, but occurred as consequences of neglect and deliberate cruelty by local governors. Prisoners were stripped of their clothing, chained to wooden posts, and left in the snow overnight as a warning to others. When morning came, many were found encased in frost, their hands frozen to the iron shackles, their faces turned to ice. Local officials reported these deaths as natural consequences of God's will. The empire's administrators began to recognize the deterrent effect of such scenes. The human body, frozen in a position of suffering, created a silent image of loyalty enforced by fear. Siberian settlements soon developed specific routines for handling rebels and deserters. When work quotas were unmet or escape attempts occurred, overseers resorted to exposure. The condemned were bound to poles beside rivers or at the edges of villages, often for entire nights. The temperature dropped far below zero and the cold did what the lash could not. By the late 17th century, the practice gained structure. Governors reported these punishments to Moscow as measures of discipline rather than cruelty. In official language, it was described as restorative suffering. The ice became an unspoken enforcer of the Tsar's authority. Those who lived through the ordeal often lost fingers, ears, or entire limbs, permanently marked as examples of disobedience. Survival was considered a sign of divine endurance, while death was viewed as purification. Witnesses described how frostbite would first numb the skin, then harden it like stone. The blood slowed and breath turned into mist that froze against the face. Those chained to posts could hear the slow cracking of their own flesh. When morning came, soldiers broke the ice from the chains before unbinding the bodies. Some corpses remained upright, their joints locked solid, appearing more like statues than men. These frozen figures were left in the open for days, symbols of what awaited any who defied the Tsar's rule. Siberian settlements were isolated, dependent on state supply routes that often froze in winter. The absence of oversight allowed local officials to enforce their own interpretations of justice. The ice block punishments became a routine part of discipline, carried out without formal sentences. Cossack commanders, prison wardens, and local nobles used them against thieves, rebels, and workers alike. The empire did not record these as executions, which made them invisible within law, but visible within fear. By the time of Peter the Great's rule, the practice had spread widely. His modernization policies required absolute obedience from soldiers, workers, and peasants. Disobedience was viewed as sabotage of the state's progress. In his drive to westernize Russia, Peter also adopted European punishments such as floggings and executions. Yet the old methods of exposure continued, particularly in the Siberian territories far from his capital. The empire's cold frontier remained loyal to the logic of frost. Peter the Great's reforms expanded the penal colonies dramatically. Thousands of convicts, serfs, and political prisoners were sent to Siberia to work in mines, forts, and logging camps. The cold itself became the overseer. Guards used exposure to control labor and morale. Prisoners who refused to work were bound to posts near the camp, sometimes doused with water that froze instantly upon their bodies. Death was slow but inevitable. Reports from Tobolsk and Yakutsk mention bodies discovered days later, frozen upright with eyes open as if still pleading. The practice became institutionalized without ever being officially written into law. It was carried by custom, repetition, and silence. Local governors justified it as necessity. The empire valued productivity over mercy, and punishment by cold cost nothing. It required no weapons, no gallows, no executioners. The elements performed the work of discipline perfectly. The land itself became part of the state's apparatus of control. Descriptions from European travelers in the 18th century confirmed the existence of such punishments. They wrote of seeing frozen bodies near roadways and riverbanks, their faces covered in frost, their chains buried in snow. Some accounts suggested that the condemned were forced to stand on blocks of ice until they collapsed from exhaustion or the ice melted beneath them. The effect was both public humiliation and certain death. Such punishments reinforced the image of the Tsar as the ultimate authority, both earthly and divine. The Orthodox Church, closely tied to imperial governance, viewed suffering as a sacred instrument of repentance. Sermons often described the endurance of cold as a trial of faith. Confession and repentance were demanded even from the dying. In this way, torture acquired moral justification. The empire presented its cruelty as divine correction, ensuring that physical agony aligned with spiritual salvation. By the mid-18th century, as the Romanov dynasty solidified its rule, the ice block punishments had become a recognized, though unofficial, tool of the Siberian penal network. They served both as deterrent and disposal. Criminals, rebels, and exiles alike vanished beneath the snow, leaving behind only fragments of chains or frozen posts as evidence. The empire's records rarely mentioned them directly, but their silence confirmed the scale. The system that began under Mikail and matured under Alexei and Peter turned Siberia into a living punishment. The landscape itself was harnessed to the service of authority. Cold, once an obstacle to expansion, became its weapon. To the rulers of Russia, the endurance of frost represented the endurance of order. Every frozen corpse was a declaration that the empire's reach extended even into death. The ice block punishments reflected the Russian state's belief that control did not require speed but permanence. The frozen body symbolized silence and compliance. It required no guard once death arrived. The empire could move forward, leaving its warnings standing like monuments of frost. This system of fear, carved by climate and faith, defined Siberian exile for centuries. It would outlast the rulers who created it, sustained by the same cold that had once been its tool. By the early 19th century, the Siberian exile system had grown into a vast network of punishment and silence. Under Tsar Nicholas I, control reached its most rigid form. His rule valued order above all else, and Siberia became both a labor colony and a graveyard for those who opposed him. The ice block punishments, though never written in law, were deeply ingrained in the culture of authority. They continued in remote outposts, carried out by soldiers who had inherited the methods of centuries past. Nicholas viewed suffering as necessary to strengthen loyalty. His administration expanded the network of mines, prisons, and transit camps. Thousands of political dissidents, peasants, and soldiers were sent northward. For the empire, Siberia served a dual purpose. It extracted labor while displaying the consequences of rebellion. The ice block punishments became part of that demonstration. Those accused of defiance or attempted escape were stripped, bound, and chained to frozen posts as others watched. The freezing wind served as the executioner. Observers described the ritual with precision. The condemned stood barefoot on the snow, their breath forming clouds that crystallized in the air. Within minutes, frost whitened their skin. The guards poured small amounts of water over their bodies, ensuring the chains adhered to the flesh. The body hardened gradually, first in silence, then with shallow gasps as blood thickened. By morning, the prisoner had become motionless, the cold having preserved every detail of pain. For the empire, such deaths required no records. They were treated as losses due to weather. Reports merely listed numbers of missing prisoners. The ice concealed all traces, erasing crime, punishment, and humanity together. To local officials, it was efficient. To the state, it was invisible justice. The cold punished without leaving blood, and the empire continued without interruption. In time, whispers of these punishments reached Europe. Foreign writers, diplomats, and travelers recorded accounts of frozen bodies found upright in the snow. They compared them to statues, lifeless but preserved, untouched by decay. These reports were dismissed by imperial officials as exaggerations, yet the silence of the victims confirmed their truth. The frozen men of Siberia became symbols of absolute obedience enforced through nature itself. Even after the decline of serfdom and the rise of modern reforms, echoes of the practice survived. Guards still used exposure as discipline, particularly in the remote prisons of Yakutia and Kolyma. The land's climate demanded no effort for execution. The same frost that preserved the empire's boundaries preserved its cruelty. By the late imperial era, the ice block punishments faded into memory, replaced by formal executions and organized labor camps. Yet their legacy endured in the structure of fear they created. The frozen bodies once left beneath the snow had served their purpose. They reminded generations that defiance against the Tsar meant surrendering to the cold. In the empire's long history, few punishments were as silent or as absolute as death by ice.